Well, as he said, I'm Risa DeMasi. I'm one of the founders of Grassland Oregon. And I was excited when Rob Myers invited me to participate because there's so much going on, and I was excited to kind of cross-pollinate with everybody here and learn some things and also kind of share what we've been working on. So for those of you who don't know who Grassland Oregon is or what we're doing and why we're excited about the growing cover crop industry, we founded our company in 2000, and because we had a strong passion to improve the sustainability of the ag community that we're part of, everything we do as a company is designed to deliver novel solutions for the growing concerns of that ag community. So in 2008, I had the privilege of joining the American Seed Trade Association Board of Directors, and in 2015 and 16, I had the pleasure of serving as their chairman. AST is one of the oldest trade associations in the United States, and as we like to say, it covers everything from alfalfa to zucchini, from small companies to large multinationals, and from organic production all the way to new breeding techniques. But our involvement as Grassland Oregon and AST has provided opportunities to communicate and advocate in larger policy discussions, to add our voice to decision-making conversations, and to cross-pollinate with those other sectors of the ag community. Because, especially now, because cover crops continue to evolve and they're affecting virtually every sector of ag. ASTA's Cover Crop Working Group has supported efforts like the CTI Seek Cover Crop Survey, which you've heard some about, I'm sure. We've lobbied for USDA Plant Materials Center funding and for better crop insurance treatment and coverage for farms utilizing cover crops. And our CEO, Andy Levine, serves on the board for the Soil Health Institute. So back to Grassland, Oregon, there was a rapid increase, once we started, there was a rapid increase in input costs, and farmers conveyed to us concerns that they had regarding loss of topsoil and a declining organic matter. We decided to put some serious effort into developing improved cover crops, or as our ancestors referred to them as green manure. We did our research to see where we could provide farmers with an immediate and the most value and a return on that investment on cover crops. And we determined that erosion control, nitrogen management, control of harmful nematodes, and weed suppression were the areas that could make the most impact. And we also realized as a mid-sized company that if we didn't utilize our resources responsibly or appropriately, we'd end up being just an inch deep and a mile wide. So being fans of history, we did a little literature review to determine what had been worked on in the past or looked at, and maybe more importantly, what had not. And we looked at the current landscape and made some conclusions. We could skip over erosion control, since it was adequately covered through some low-cost commodity items like cereal rye and annual ryegrass. And by utilizing our global network of research and breeding programs, we could access and license existing material that was highly effective against those harmful nematodes. This left the existing opportunity for our breeding program to focus on nitrogen traits and weed suppression. So why are we excited? Because now we have the distinct pleasure and the opportunity of offering revolutionary cover crop tools. And I'm going to stop short of giving you the details on some of these, just for now. First, I'd like to share some of the other reasons that we're excited about the cover crop market and why it made me think of icebergs and tsunamis. And because we're just at the very beginning stages of understanding the vast potential that's out there. So we hear a lot about corn and soybean acres when we talk about cover crops. And if you consider the corn for grain and soybean acres, your cover crop world is about 163 million acres. Certainly nothing to sneeze at, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. Consider a few other opportunities that exist, such as vineyards, orchards, wheat, pastures. Your cover crop world expands pretty quickly. And while this list is not at all comprehensive, it highlights an additional 246 million acres of opportunity. And if you consider that the Ag Census data from 2012 showed 914.5 million acres of farmland, and you take out woodland and other land, this number is still a behemoth at 805 million acres. Each of these sectors have similar and unique challenges and goals, and identifying and understanding these goals only unlock additional opportunities. The recent CTI Seek Cover Crop Survey shows there's been a steady increase in cover crop acreage among participants, if that wasn't already obvious by everybody you've been hearing today. Farmers this year said they committed an average of 400 acres to cover crops in 2016, which is up from 217 acres per farm in 2012. This year's survey respondents expect to increase their cover crop planting in 2017 to an average of 451 acres. Current estimates put us at close to 20 million acres in the next year or so of cover crop use. And while that might seem like a significant number, it represents less than 5% of that vast potential. The growth of the cover crop use will expand a whole range of business opportunities throughout agriculture, and Betsy and Gary both alluded to those. So at the tip of this iceberg are the goals and benefits of cover crops that kind of got the ball rolling, or the why of using them. As you can see, there are a multitude of goals and benefits of cover crops, and each farmer should have their own specific list for their farm and their management style. And the one goal we hear all the time is sustainability. But what does it mean, really? I mean, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, making it critical that we dive down deeper and we define it, or we will never accomplish anything measurable. My dad, who's a beef farmer, often says that if he is not making money, he is not sustainable. And there's a farmer who I greatly respect, and I haven't seen him around today, but he's here from Indiana. He always says, why do we talk about sustainability when we talk about soil health? Why would we want to sustain a depleted system? What we're doing with cover crops is rejuvenating our soil resource. And recently, one of our distributors up in Iowa mentioned, and he moonlights as an EMT, he's planning on using a defibrillator as a picture tool to show how cover crops are reviving our soil resources. So Merriam-Webster's definition of sustainability is of, relating to, or being a method of harvesting or using a resource so that that resource is not depleted or permanently damaged. So for our intents and purposes as it relates to cover crops, our sustainability includes our soil resources, our financial resources, and our farming systems. It includes soil health, system health, and financial health, or a healthy return on that investment. So icebergs aren't static, right? They move and they calve constantly. The same goes for cover crop icebergs. Each one of the goals on this slide, when broken off of the larger iceberg, become icebergs of opportunities on their own. So let's look at a couple of them. Weed suppression. There are opportunities to address this with allelopathy, biomass, root structures, and timing. Timing is going to be key, whether you have early or late needs. You have nitrogen contribution. There are opportunities to address this with fixation, scavenging, that timing again of that availability. And I've heard a lot today from speakers about, do you want that early nitrogen kick or that late nitrogen kick? And then biology. We can affect the system's biology by looking at beneficial or detrimental attributes of the cover crops that we're using, and look above ground. Are we creating bridges or problems with rodents or disease, or are we fixing that? And then below ground, if you haven't seen the local or the recent tweets from the Soil Health Institute, only about 1% of the microbes have been identified. We can look at, our cover crops. Are we having an effect? Are we hosts or non-hosts for those nematodes or other harmful or beneficial microorganisms? So now we've touched on parts of the market and some of the measurable goals. Now let's look at some of the tools that we use to meet those goals. So you'll recognize some of the familiar and maybe a few that you haven't considered. According to the CTI Seek cover crop survey, cereal, rye grain, oats, and radish are the most widely used species. I believe this is primarily due to the fact that they were used by our grandfathers, and so they were a familiar place for us to start, again. And what's listed below is a small collection of available tools, some of which you may never heard of, but can be highly effective. And I'm sure at this point you can start to conceptualize cover crop icebergs of opportunities for equipment, transportation, application methods, and farm advisory resources, which both Gary and Betsy have mentioned also. And this is where you can begin to sense the oncoming tsunami. So let's talk about the evolution of this market. And originally I was going to start this section with, this is an exciting time when the collective efforts in research and breeding are providing new genetic breakthroughs in species and varieties all the time. And then last week I read an article. It was one of our industry publications, and it stated that few new varieties were being developed specifically for cover crops, and much of what was being developed was just a recycling or reworking of the products we use for forage and turf. There was even a quote from one of the editors who said, I don't know anybody who's working specifically on cover crops. And although I was quoted it vaguely at the end of the piece, after reading it, I wanted to jump up and down and say, hey, over here. Or as my New York Italian husband would say, hey, what am I, wood? But Grassland Oregon's been actively breeding varieties specifically for cover crop use for over 17 years now. In fact, we've introduced more unique species and varieties than all of our competitors combined. Of course, if you read that article, it's maybe not saying a whole lot, but I think it's important to note that we're not alone in our research and our breeding of cover crop species and varieties specifically for this purpose. So perhaps companies like ourselves are too entrenched in our own efforts to develop and prove the efficacy of our products that we don't get the word out or tell our stories well enough, which is something else that Betsy alluded to. Maybe we're all speaking slightly different ag dialects or maybe different ag languages altogether. There's been a reluctance for universities and even government organizations to talk about improved varieties. It's a little like separation of church and state. I think there's a little fear of losing that objectivity. Perhaps we're still stuck in thinking about cover crops in terms of our ancestors, both recent and distant past. Perhaps the lack of knowledge about improved cover crop genetics is a combination of all of this and more. And just one more challenge, which is also an opportunity for communication and educational outreach. And it's also something I'll get back to in just a moment. But let me be crystal clear on this. We really need to get away from shoving everything into species baskets. This may have been relevant at the turn of the last century or before the dawn of the Green Revolution. But today we're doing farmers a disservice. Today varieties really matter, and there are huge variations between them. So let me ask you, are all cows the same? Just like breeds of cattle, they've been optimized over time to meet specific needs and purposes, for increased milk production or increased meat production for different climates. And as we as plant breeders are doing the same thing in developing varieties within a species. So a rose is a rose, or in the cover crop world, a clover is a clover, right? It pains me to hear cover crop experts, when they talk to farmers, say, well, if you want a little nitrogen, just plant a little clover in your mix. Here's just a small, and you just saw just a small sampling of the clover species world, and they're all vastly different. So the temptation to talk about absolutes and generalities is easy and it's really convenient. But as you can see, there's a world of difference. Besides the obvious difference in biomass, this subspecies of Balanza clover, which is not historically known to be cold tolerant, comes from the Mediterranean. This cultivar fixation can survive well into the -degree temperatures. And we're continuing to take things further in our breeding programs. We have 8 additional cultivars in this subspecies alone, and they're all vastly different, which is about to make things even more interesting and more complex. We can provide better advice and add so much more value to farmers by doing just a little bit of homework. Here's a listing of 4 different clovers. Well, 2 of them were crimson, but even the difference between those different varieties. So look at the obvious morphological differences between these 2 triticale varieties. One's compact, the one in the foreground, with better ground cover, and maybe it provides some weed suppression. The one in the back is a little taller and allowing better sunlight. Maybe it's going to be good as an intercropping tool. And if you look at the recent report from the USDA Plant Material Center in Oregon, Annie Young Matthews trials show substantial differences in the seeds per pound, which influence how much is spent on a per acre basis. The differences in cereal rye alone, and these are just different cultivars and varieties, would mean the difference in planting 57 pounds per acre or 141 pounds per acre. That's huge. And then if you consider hairy vetch, it ranged from just over 12,000 seeds per pound to 20,000 seeds per pound. Again, almost double. So here's a soybean cyst nematode study. As you can see, there's a wide variation among just the alfalfa varieties. And more nematode studies are needed. I mean, it's going to be critical that we get this, because you hear more and more about the nematode problems. And they really need to be by cultivar and not by species for all the reasons I'm outlining. Because any of these studies that are done by variety not stated, what's it really telling you? It's kind of less than helpful. So let's go back to that earlier iceberg slide and highlight some of the species which I know have commercially available varieties, are in current breeding programs, or being evaluated for cover crop use. And we've already seen how each of these can and are being broken down into smaller icebergs. And after 17 years, we're excited at Grassland, Oregon, because we're finally starting to realize the dreams and the visions that we had for our company. We've introduced the first round of revolutionary cover crop clover genetics from our own breeding program, and we've broken records in cold tolerance and nitrogen fixation. We've introduced nematode controlling radish from one of the world's leading breeding programs, and we've partnered with one of our distributors to introduce a winter pea with exceptional winter survivability. So if you'll just indulge me a little bit, I'll tell you about a couple of them. So remember that fixation Balanza clover in one of the previous slides? This clover can survive down to -26 degrees with snow cover. It can fix more than 350 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and with a CN ratio of 15:1, over 230 pounds of that becomes almost immediately accessible as plant-available nitrogen. It can grow in waterlogged soils and survive short periods of flooding. It can suppress weeds. And it can break up compaction. Okay, this doesn't really show compaction, but I love this picture. That is a single plant of fixation. So we're also proud to offer those nematode controlling radish varieties. And the ones that we've introduced include Image, Tahuna, and Karwoody. These were bred to selectively control detrimental strains of nematodes. Nematodes which have robbed sugar beet farmers and potato farmers of yield and profit for years. These radishes work by exuding a chemical, inducing the nematode larvae to hatch, prematurely hatch. And once hatched, those radishes provide no nutrition and starve those nematodes, breaking the cycle and drastically reducing the populations in the soil. And in Europe, they have a government-run class rating system, and there are only two classes. A class 1 variety must be at least 90% effective at controlling that designated pest, and a class 2 rated variety must be at least 80% effective. And if a species doesn't meet these specifications, it cannot be listed, promoted, or marketed as a control. All three of those varieties that I mentioned earlier are class 1 varieties. And they're also good at scavenging those nitrates and keeping them from leaching into the waterways, and are effective at breaking up compaction. And these are just the tip of our iceberg. We have several commercially available value-added cover crop genetics and enough in our breeding pipeline for the next decade and beyond. And while I'm on this soapbox and ongoing evolution of this market, I hope it's obvious, if it wasn't before, the reasons to avoid variety not stated, or VNS, or some branded seed. Without knowing the cultivar, there's no way to know how much to plant, how to manage it, what traits may or may not be within those seeds. And farmers aren't stupid. They're stubborn, but they're not stupid. They'd never plant a cash crop without knowing exactly what to expect when they put it in the ground. And that's yield potential, disease package, pest package, climate adaptation, performance on different soil types. Cover crops really aren't any different. And today, with so much information available, it's irresponsible to plant cover crops without knowing what to expect. Ask your seed supplier, ask Betsy, ask Gary, for the data to back up any claims. We feel strongly that any claims that are made should be backed up, and we feel that all plant breeders should back those up. Which brings us to the ever-swelling tsunami of opportunities for those of you in the room today. And out of what you said, I'm just going to whip through these pretty quick, because you've covered it really well. Cover crops aren't easy, and they're going to continue to get more complex as more research is done. But the numerous benefits that they provide, rejuvenating our soil resources, resuscitating our subterranean ecosystems, and making the production of the food and drink we consume, the clothes we wear, the cars we drive more sustainable, and our farms more profitable, is really why we do what we do, right? And it's worth taking the extra effort to do it right. So by doing just that little bit of extra homework, there are overwhelming opportunities to differentiate yourself, to specialize, and to provide value. And again, I'm going to whip through this pretty fast because Betsy covered it and Gary both, they covered a lot of these opportunities already. So when you look at become a seed dealer, provide those value-added cover crop seeds, specialize in a particular goal or benefit or options for a particular crop or cropping cycle. I mean, if you're looking at vineyards and orchards, if you have a lot of vineyards in your area, there's a huge opportunity. And differentiate yourself with those high-performing varieties. And expand your network, which Betsy did a great job of saying exactly why you want to do that. Connect with those breeding programs, connect with those insurance providers, conservation districts, the government incentive program administrators, and somebody else mentioned something today too, bankers. Bankers are really important to keep in the loop. So local cover crop plots, that is critical, because seeing is believing, right? Especially locally. We can do a lot of, we can't put plots out everywhere, but those demonstration plots are huge. And they give you, if you're an ag retailer or a seed dealer, give you an opportunity to highlight some of the other services and products that you've got. And equipment, I've already seen slides today about how people are getting innovative with tweaking their equipment to use for cover crop seeding, but I think the equipment industry is probably going to be coming out with some exciting things. So these next three are kind of related, but they're different enough, I think, that they deserve their own iceberg. And again, Betsy's alluded to a lot of this, but education. You have an opportunity to put on paid seminars or free seminars, however you want to do it, but for your customers, and create those roundtables where you're connecting all those dots in the network. Include those crop insurers, the managers, the breeders, the bankers. You can provide that crop insurance for them and government program information. And consulting, this is where it can get really prescriptive. You can get on their farms, you're looking at their system, especially as an ag retailer. You're looking at them 365 days a year. You have a huge opportunity. You know their operation inside and out, so that you can fit everything together. And expertise, again, this is something that Betsy, I think, highlighted really well, is you are the local experts. You have that value, that trust, those relationships, you have those community ties that can be so important. So each one of these icebergs, or each one of these opportunities in these icebergs, can directly provide new revenue streams or indirectly increase your existing ones by helping farmers put all of those pieces together. So the CTI Seek survey results show the top 2 places farmers would like to purchase their cover crop seed are cover crop dealers that are specific or ag retailers. As an ag retailer, I believe you can be one and the same. You can be the local cover crop dealer. And there's a serious need for information that provides more consistent and dependable results. Again, last week I just read another article leading readers to believe that with all the calls to save our soil resources and using cover crops and all of those government incentives, things were getting worse and not better. Let's not let that be our legacy. We can do better for our farms and our soil. So educate yourself at the very least on the cover crop basics. Starting with what are the goals? Ask lots of questions. Find out why they want to use cover crops. A lot of times, like Betsy said, they'll walk in and say, I want to try something, but I don't know what. And if we don't know where we want to go, we'll never get there, and neither will our soils. And the next 2 kind of go hand in hand, quality and cost. And let me tell you, quality counts. Seed companies are governed by the Federal Seed Act, and we're required to test each lot and label each container with basic quality information. To create these labels, we rely on tests that have been conducted by independent registered seed analysts. And at a minimum, you should know how to read and understand the information on that tag. And if your seed supplier cannot provide a test or a tag, don't buy that seed. And I'm sure you're familiar with the term garbage in, garbage out. It's as true in seed as it is for computers. When we sell or buy strictly on price, whether it be VNS, a lot with a few minor quality issues, or a neighbor's self-grown seed which is neither tested nor labeled, or worse yet, bin run grain. That one kills me. You don't know how much to plant. It may not germinate. You won't know if it'll meet your goals, and it may increase pests, diseases, and weeds. And by the time those problems start popping up, it's too late. You're shooting in the dark in performance expectations if you don't have an idea of the quality of seed you're planting. And you can incur considerable extra expense in corrective measures. Did you know a single mare's tail plant can produce up to 200,000 seeds per plant? And Palmer amaranth, up to 1 million seeds per plant. One plant. And while we're speaking of expenses, in the seed industry we're traditionally wired to think in terms of cost per pound. Thankfully, the conversation is changing as seed industry professionals take the time to educate themselves and their customers on the more accurate calculations of cost per acre. The multitude of species and varieties in cover crops are vastly different in their shapes, their sizes, their density, and subsequent planting rates. So while there can be a wide variation in cost per pound, the cost per acre and the traits that in a cultivar can tell a very different story. And this is an important consideration as we start putting them all together to form those cover crop mixes. And I'd like to think we've kind of gotten away from that throwing the spaghetti against the wall stage, or planting as many species as possible, just hoping that something's going to come up, or something's going to provide some sort of benefit. There are really good reasons to put different varieties and species together, and we need to be thoughtful and intentional in how we combine them to meet the specific goals of farm and soil. And many plants don't play nice with each other. A haphazard approach is just a waste of valuable time and financial resources. For example, mixing that image beet cyst control radish that I talked about with dwarf Essex rape or any number of daikon radish varieties, studies have shown that both dwarf Essex rape and several of those daikon radish varieties are beet cyst nematode hosts. So what you're essentially doing is waking up those hungry nematodes and then providing an absolute feast for them and compounding your original problem. Here's another example. In our last few years of vineyard and orchard cover crop trials, we were experiencing some allelopathy with the cereal rye cultivar we used, and it was suppressing the other components of that mixture, while the alternative triticale cultivar did not. Cover crops are part of this overall system, above and below the ground, 365 days a year. And we need to connect all of those dots. And we really need to work together. And as I've alluded to through this talk, education and communication are tremendous opportunities existing all up and down the stakeholder chain. And at Grassland, Oregon, that's another thing we're passionate about, is education. And because we saw a need, we recently published the Cover Crop Basics booklet, which includes the basics I've just mentioned here and more in what we hope is a very easy to understand format. And I don't know if you've seen it, but this is it. And in just over a month after we released it, which was not long ago, we had over 3,000 digital copies downloaded, and it took 3 print runs to meet the need of the 9,000 copies that were requested. And it was only sent by request. We didn't mail them out, just willy-nilly to people. And I'd say that's proof of a need. And if you're interested in a copy, come see me at my booth. We're just downstairs in that back hallway. And in closing, and because of all the differences in species and cultivars, and because of the importance of education, all of these icebergs of opportunity are becoming a tsunami, which can lead to a train wreck or a wipeout. But let's work together to take advantage of the overwhelming opportunities. Many, if not all in this room, are the experts that farmers are going to go to look for help. And maybe even especially if you yourself are a farmer. This is a fast-moving and ever-changing sector of agriculture. Let's continue to educate ourselves and each other. Let's seek out partners who believe in the importance of performance and education. And let's be bold in sharing our experiences, both successes and failures. Because let me tell you, some of the most important things we've learned have come from what looked like an absolute epic fail. And we can save each other that time and energy in relearning those lessons. And we can be more efficient by working together to move this market forward in a successful way. So I invite you to join us in catching a wave. Hang tight, and thank you.